Politics Naturalized, David Hume. Part 1. Human Nature, Property and Justice Conventions. Scotland in the 18th century had a total population of just over 1 million people, more or less the same number of people who now live in Dallas or San Diego. Yet this tiny population produced an astonishing outburst of philosophical, economic and historical writing that has radically affected how we think about the world. The two most well-known names from the period of the Scottish Enlightenment are those of Adam Smith and David Hume. But there were many others: Francis Hutcheson, Adam Ferguson, Henry Hume, James Stewart, Thomas Reid and John Miller. Adam Smith is perhaps best known for his 1776 book, An Inquiry into the Wealth of Nations. But his other major work, The Theory of Moral Sentiments, is in many ways a more significant and long-lasting contribution than his more well-known treatise on economics. David Hume was born in Edinburgh in 1711, where he attended the university at the age of 12. After an extensive course of study and some foreign residence, he produced his A Treatise on Human Understanding when he was only 26 years old. This book, which is now considered to be one of the most significant works in Western philosophy, made almost no impression upon its publication, and what little impression it did make was largely negative. After the disappointment of the reception of the treatise, Hume turned his attention to the production of a series of essays on moral and political topics, which were quite well received, and he finally found fame and fortune with the publication of his 6-volume History of England. Repeated efforts on his part to be appointed to a university chair all ended in failure, and Hume had to be content with a position as a librarian. Later in life, he spent some time in Paris as a secretary to Lord Hertford, where he met, among others, Rousseau, who managed to find reason to quarrel with him. He returned to Scotland to take up a position as Under Secretary of State and settled in Edinburgh until his death in 1776. It may not be immediately obvious why Hume should merit a place in a history of political philosophy, given that his writings in this area are neither extensive nor what he is best known for in philosophical circles. Why then are his reflections on political philosophy significant? Well, briefly, what makes his political thinking significant is that he issues a fundamental challenge to the assumption made by many modern political theorists that political authority is legitimate only if it rests on the consent of those over whom it is exercised. Some theorists believe that such consent has to be explicit, and when it isn't, which is most of the time for most people, then political authority is illegitimate. Others argue that implicit or tacit consent is sufficient to grant political authority, and that such consent can be evidence from people's acquiescence in the activities of the state. Both parties accept the necessity of consent for the legitimation of political authority. But it is precisely this assumption that Hume rejects. The consent of the governed, he thinks, is not in any way a necessary condition of the legitimacy of government. Let's see how his story unfolds. In the treatise, Hume begins his political reflections with some anthropological comments, noting that while man has a seemingly endless stream of desires, he is singularly ill-equipped by nature to satisfy them. As he exists by nature, he is provided neither with arms, nor force, nor other natural abilities, which are in any degree answerable to so many necessities. The solution to man's perplexity lies in society. Even though in society his already burgeoning desires are multiplied, his ability to satisfy them is multiplied even more, leaving him in every respect more satisfied and happy than it is possible for him in his savage and solitary condition ever to become. In his solitary condition, man's labour is relatively insignificant. Having to do all for himself in many things, he is unable to attain perfection in anything, and depending on himself alone, his ability to survive failure is slight. Society remedies all three of these idiosyncratic deficiencies. In cooperating with others, the effect of man's labour is disproportionately increased. In the division of labour made possible by his life with others, his ability to attain perfection increases. And with others to help him, no longer is individual failure tantamount to disaster. Society, then, is advantageous to man, but this is not a conclusion that can be reached by pure reason alone. The concept of reason has been a constituent part of theoretical and practical thought for most of Western history. In the 18th century, the nature, scope, and limitations of reason became a contentious topic for philosophers, notoriously for Immanuel Kant, whose first critical work is called Critique of Pure Reason, but also for Kant's predecessor and inspiration, David Hume. Reason was the watchword and the principal tool of the Enlightenment. If water is the universal solvent, then reason for Enlightenment thinkers was the solvent of superstition, dogma, tradition, custom, and habit. Within the broader Enlightenment circle, a reaction set in which, without rejecting reason, its more ambitious claims to universal reach were contested. In the 18th century, Hume and Burke, each in his own way, insisted on confining reason within its proper limits in practical matters, as Kant was to do in metaphysics. Hume's principal philosophical works, A Treatise of Human Nature, An Inquiry Concerning Human Understanding, and his An Inquiry Concerning the Principle of Morals, are by common consent recognized as being a stern attack on the claims of reason to provide a solid basis for intellectual inquiry and morality. The implications of Hume's attack on religion and morality, as traditionally defended, need not directly concern us, but his criticism was also directed at any and all efforts to construct political theory on a rational basis, in particular efforts to employ theories of natural rights and contract or consent for that purpose. One could simply accept Hume's criticism and leave it at that. On the other hand, one could argue that his conception of reason is artificially narrow, and that an expanded conception of reason, one that could see reason as embodied not in abstract formula but in custom and tradition, would rescue man's practical life from the accusation of irrationality. Instead of regarding custom and tradition as the antithesis of reason, writes Sabine, the new philosophy preferred to see in them the gradual unfolding of a reason implicit in the consciousness of the race or nation. Hence, they are no burden which the enlightened individual must shuffle off, but a precious heritage to be guarded, and into which it is the high privilege of the individual to be inducted. If men were originally solitary and depended upon a rational calculation of advantage to bring society into being, society would never have come into being. If men were reliant upon the slender reed of reason to achieve his ends, he would be in trouble. But luckily, what reason cannot supply is remedied by a natural necessity. That necessity, writes Hume, is no other than the natural appetite betwixt the sexes, which unites them together and preserves their union till a new tie takes place in their concern for their common offspring. With the production of children, the conjugal union becomes a family, in which the natural authority of the parents, deriving from their physical strength and superior knowledge, is tempered by the natural affection they bear towards their offspring. While Hume is aware that the bonds of family life, if unbalanced, can be inimical to the interests of society at large, and also aware that there are in man centripetal forces counteracting the centrifugal tendencies that hold the family society together, he nonetheless believes the asocial account of the human condition given by thinkers such as Hobbes to be distorted. According to Hume, we have three kinds of good: our subjective mental life, our bodily powers, and our external possessions. Our subjective mental life is directly available to ourselves alone, and so no one can be tempted to relieve us of it for their own use. Our bodily powers can be taken from us through injury or death, but that in itself brings no particular advantage to any would-be assailant. However, our external possessions are detachable from us, and their possession is valuable to those who would deprive us of them. Now, this wouldn't matter much if we lived in a magic world in which such goods were instantaneously replaceable without cost, but that unfortunately is not the case. The facts are, then, that our external goods are scarce, and because of that scarcity, our possession of them is unstable. We cannot appeal to our basic nature to provide for the stability of these external goods, because our natural and untutored concerns are directed first to ourselves, second to our relations and friends, and finally, and most feebly of all, to strangers. Tom and Dick each desire what only one of them can have, and there is no antecedent reason why Tom rather than Dick should have it. This is where, despite Hume's well-known general depreciation of the pretensions of reason, reason rides to the rescue. The remedy then is, he says, not derived from nature, but from artifice, or more properly speaking, nature provides a remedy in the judgment and understanding for what is irregular and incommodious in the affections. If the possession of external goods is unstable by nature, then it can be rendered stable only by a convention in which the stability of the possession of external goods is recognized by all in society, conventions being simply the rules that actually regulate conduct. Significantly, such rules are not necessarily the result of a contract or an agreement. One of Hume's examples of a convention is that of two men rowing a boat. Because they share a commonality of purpose, they coordinate their rowing without any need for someone to order them about, or without any need for an explicit agreement. It could be argued that the emergence of a convention in respect of external goods is, on Hume's own assumptions, unlikely, given our natural self-centred propensities. But this, he thinks, is not so. Such a convention is not contrary to the passions, merely to their heedless and impetuous movement. And in abiding by it, we gain more than we lose. Hume goes on to say, there is no passion, therefore, capable of controlling the interested affection, but the very affection itself, by an alteration of its direction. Now this alteration must necessarily take place upon the least reflection, since 'tis evident that the passion is much better satisfied by its restraint than by its liberty, and that in preserving society we make much greater advances in the acquiring of possessions than in the solitary and forlorn condition which must follow upon violence and a universal license. Ever since the time of Plato, philosophers have drawn a sharp distinction in man between his reason and his passions, and have often portrayed the passions as wild and capricious impulses to be tamed or controlled by reason. Hume is one philosopher who takes the passions to be simply what they are, a constituent part of man, and the moving force at the root of human action. Most of our passions are social, or at least not antisocial, but one passion, namely self-interest, is essentially antisocial. If it is to be held in check, this can be done only by the influence of another passion, for one passion may be confronted and altered only by another, not by reason. The role of reason is to inform an actor where his interest lies. We are naturally inclined to seek out whatever promotes our self-interest, but this natural inclination is limited in its views and disposed to seek immediate gratification to the detriment of our longer-term interests. At this point, reason enters in to indicate that the idea of property, with its correlative three laws of justice, is actually conducive to the enlargement of our interest, together with those of others. Justice, writes McClelland, is certainly a human invention, and is to that extent unnatural. But justice is also natural in the sense that human reason everywhere has seen the need for justice if human living is ever to advance beyond a very primitive state. The discovery of justice may be halting and accidental, but once justice, however primitive, is established, human reason has no difficulty in seeing its advantages. How does the convention of property arise? Not by design, and not by planning, but by a dawning recognition on the part of everyone that the reciprocal recognition of stable rights of ownership is to everyone's benefit. Hume writes, nor is the rule concerning the stability of possessions the less derived from human conventions, that it arises gradually and acquires force by a slow progression, and by a repeated experience of the inconveniences of transgressing it. The emergence of the property convention, then, resembles the way in which languages or money come into being. Languages and money emerge spontaneously from common practices tending towards the promotion of everyone's interests. Human action can be considered from different perspectives. Those actions can be said to be primary that make up the bulk of human conduct, eating meals, talking to friends, shopping for pizza, and so on. Actions that bear on primary actions, encouraging them, discouraging them, punishing them, and so on, can be said to be secondary. The difference between primary and secondary actions is similar to what we find in sports, where the players are engaged in primary actions and the referee or other officials are engaged in secondary actions. Of course, Secondary actions can themselves become the object of further social controls. Primary actions embody norms to practice. You can play or watch a game without a completely explicit grasp of its rules, whereas secondary actions require explicit reflection on the norms. Logic is the explicit articulation of the raciocinative practices embodied in reasoning. Grammar is the explicit articulation of the linguistic practices embodied in speaking. Ethics is the explicit articulation of the socially cohesive practices already embodied in interpersonal relations. When we learn logic as a discipline, it enables us to reflectively appropriate what it is we do when we reason, and allows us to become better at what we do already. What it does not do is to allow us to learn to do something we have never ever done before. We learn grammar only after we already speak our language, not before. And ethics is a meaningless enterprise if we have not already grasped its essence in practice before we begin to think about it. Nobody learns to be ethical by taking Aristotle's 30 drachma course. The sense of the dictum that ignorance of the law is no defence is to be found in the fact that no one who lives in a community can be unaware of how the basic rules for peaceful coexistence actually function in that community, any more than the native speaker of a language can be unaware of the rules of the language. To know the law in this sense, it is not necessary to be able to state it, defend it, or justify it, any more than knowing implicitly the rules of, let's say, English syntax requires a native speaker to be able to state explicitly what those rules are. I can know that boy the deck burning on stood the is gibberish in English without being able to say exactly why. Justice and property, as distinct from mere possession, emerge together. For property is the moral and subsequently legal right to make exclusive use of certain goods. Property and justice are covalent notions. Hume writes, "It is very preposterous, therefore, to imagine that we have any idea of property without fully comprehending the nature of justice and showing its origin in the artifice and contrivance of men. The origin of justice explains that of property. The same artifice gives rise to both." Craig Smith remarks that, for the Scots, and particularly for Hume and Smith, notions of property and justice are coeval. Their origins are intimately related and indeed explain each other. For Hume, the notion of justice can only exist where the conditions for it exist, and as these conditions are the same as those which produce conventions of property, then the origins of the two concepts are mutually explanatory. Once the correlative notions of property and justice have emerged and are instantiated in society, the most significant impediment to the fruitful cooperation of people has been removed. If man were universally benevolent, instead of his benevolences radiating outwards from himself to his immediate environment and diminishing in intensity as it expands, and if there were no economic scarcity, then the nexus of property and justice would have little or no purchase in the human condition. Hume writes, "If every man had a tender regard for another, or if nature supplied abundantly all our wants and desires, then the jealousy of interest which justice supposes could no longer have place, nor would there be any occasion for those distinctions and limits of property and possession which at present are in use among mankind." But man is not universally benevolent, and scarcity is a permanent part of the human condition, so that the conventions of property and justice are here to stay. The idea of justice, then, is not derived by any process of a priori abstract analysis, but is rather derived from the natural facts of the limited generosity of man and economic scarcity. Nature, as already mentioned, providing a remedy in the judgment and understanding for what is irregular and incommodious in the affections. The fundamental dynamic underlying the convention of property is reciprocity. Andy has an interest in respecting the property of Bob, Charlie, and Don, provided that Bob, Charlie, and Don respect his property. The recognition of a mutual interest is enough to ground the convention. No promises are needed, promise-keeping itself being just another convention. The convergence on mutual interest that grounds the convention of property is liable to fray at the edges under the natural tendency that all men have to prefer their own interest rather than the interests of all. That being so, the artificial virtue of justice arises, again by convention, to strengthen the primary property convention. There are three rules, then, of justice: stability in possession, the most important rule; consensual property transfer; and the requirement that promises be kept. We observe the rules of justice not because they necessarily maximize our short-term interests, they may do, but then again they may not, but because their observance serves our long-term interest. For Hayek, writes Paul Kelly, regimes of property are part of the spontaneous order of market societies. They grow up as the result of the myriad micro-decisions of individual agents, and therefore represent a convergence of individual wisdom and reason that cannot be fully comprehended by any single mind. Hayek follows Hume both in his conventionalism and in his rejection of rationalism, which Hayek claims re-emerges with the desire for justice as redistribution. Spontaneous order, self-generating or self-organizing order, is an idea that originates with the widespread acceptance of the idea of Bernard Manivelle in different forms by Scottish philosophers of the 18th century and extends downwards through time. From Mandeville and Hutchinson and Smith and Hume and Ferguson to Burke to Darwin, who got the idea of James Hutton, to Herbert Spencer and Huxley, on to Menger, Boomberberg, Weiser and von Mises, to Hayek, Polanyi, that is Michael Polanyi, Popper and Oakeshott. For Hume, then, obligations can arise from conventions without the interposition of promise-keeping, agreement or contract. But this is a direct assault on the fundamental assumption of all forms of contractarianism. The contract theorist holds that obligations can only arise on foot of the promises embodied in contractual agreements. Contract theorists argue that government is justified because men consent to it or contract for it, either explicitly or implicitly. Others, such as Lysander Spooner and myself, argue that there is no contract and, taken as a given that without such a contract there can be no obligation, if there is no contract, there is no obligation. Both parties to the dispute fixate on the necessity for contract for the existence of political obligation. Hume rejects the assumption common to both parties, arguing that obligation can arise without any contract. Political legitimacy, writes Paul Kelly, cannot be based on a contract or promise because the practice of promise-keeping itself depends upon a widely accepted convergence of interest that undermines the basic premise of social contract arguments, namely that the natural condition is one of conflict. Whatever convergence of interest is necessary to legitimate a promise is sufficient to legitimize government. 3. Hume considers the property justice establishing convention to be so obviously beneficial for all that he believes man could not for long have lived in a pre-social condition. In fact, he claims that man's very first state and situation may justly be esteemed social. The pre-social state of nature, beloved of philosophers, is a fiction on a par with the idea of the Golden Age.